I'm Eric Halivni, sitting with Fred Horowitz in Tel Aviv on February 15, 2009.
Louder.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about where you grew up, your family, parents, siblings?
My name is Fred Horowitz. I was born on October 5th, 1920, in the town of West Germany, Dortmund. Childhood was very, very difficult because it was just after World War I. Things were difficult, and my parents were immigrants who came from Galicia. My father was in World War II in the German army because he was in Germany before the war. And yet he was very, very strong on keeping traditions of his home. I don't know whether it was purely religious. It might have been more a tradition of the lifestyle of the parent or the grandparent as a loyalty to it rather than even today, I was a very person who wanted to know everything. And I had great difficulty because I didn't belong I wasn't a German. And it was very difficult to understand how can you be a Jew and be a German and where. So somehow I learned to live part of as a bystander. I went to a public school, which was a Jewish public school, which was financed by the German government, because there in those times everybody paid taxes for religion taxes. I think 5% tax. Religion taxes, therefore each religion had their own schools, and you could only teach elementary ideas about any religion what there was, but then you had to learn additional school. You had to go to the synagogue, I think. You had to learn, if you want to learn, there was one small program of that you learned Judaism, and then you had to go to a cheder. There was no yeshiva there. And the cheder were comparatively limited, but they were sustaining the people there. It was difficult for young people to live a dual life because you wanted to be part of society. You want to play football, or you play other things on the street, or to be just like anything else. They were like holidays. You want to go like everybody marched, you want to. And somehow I wound up, let's say, at the age of 10, I was already a member of the SIJ, this was called Sozialistische Arbeiterjugend. And yet at the same time, there was a family in our town who had about 6, 7 sons, and they took on themselves to be the leaders of the religious youth in our town, at different ages. And they were, at those years in the beginning, they did it under the framework of Ezra. And later on, as things became more difficult and Zionism became more practical for the, we turned over, it became Bachat, Brit Chalutzim Datim. And it's amazing how much we learned and how much we did. This kept us somewhat in strength as having a Jewish frame. Besides, we learned in the cheder, but the whole attitude of it was somewhat, it kept that your Judaism, you didn't have to practice the belonging, you had a belonging, and somebody directed us in areas where it was well done, probably. But the most difficulty what I suffered was that I wanted to participate in I played football and I played this, but still I didn't belong there. It was them and us. And we suffered, what I suffered was very, very difficult of seeing the economic depression around me. There was deep, deep poverty. And every Monday and Thursday was a different government. They had not a government, just like something similar like in Israel today. They didn't have enough, so they went this, and then the communists fought with the Nazis, and the other people say, I don't care who it is, as long as you can stop all the demonstrations and the fighting on the street. And that Hitler was no different than Lieberman here. That he knew what exactly to say the right things to the right people. I finished there in Germany. You went to high school. On 5th grade, you had to decide. 4th grade, you had to decide whether you were going to go higher education or lower education. And I went in 4th grade. I went to test. And I went to high school, and it was very interesting. This was the beginning of 1933, Hitler already came to power. And I was able to go to school. I had to go on Saturday to school, because it's obligation to go to school. But I got a permit not to ride on Shabbos. So then later on they became the guy had teachers with a Nazi emblem on the, what do you call it? He said, what kind of people, strangers came here, they demand free, different rights and different, but there was nothing you could do. And then, I think in 7th grade or something, I was pretty well in class. I was, I think, I was the second best or best student in the class. So I was one of those who checked all the homework from everybody, even with the Nazis. Half the kids were already Hitlerjugend uniform. And I had friends in the class, and it was amazing. If you think back, I was able to go home to some of them who came to school in the Nazi uniform. I went to his house, we did the homework together. And somehow I managed, and I was very strong, so nobody in the class bothered me. And then one day they caught me, all the kids, and put me in the paper, in the basket. There was like a big steel basket in the yard. And they put me there, locked me there, and then I was there for about 24 hours. And I never went back to school, and I went back to public school. I finished a year and a half public school. And life was after I finished school, life was very difficult. You knew you had to leave sooner or later. You didn't know where, you couldn't get out, you didn't have, it wasn't that you didn't want to go, but you couldn't go, you had no entrance visa for any country.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I had two sisters. I had an older sister, one sister 7 years older than me, one sister 6 years younger than me. It was very, very difficult. And
do you remember Kristallnacht?
I wasn't there anymore. I left before, now I tell you. So then I saw things were not going well. And I wasn't waiting. I was not the kind of person who waited for things to happen. I didn't even wait for my parents. I hitchhiked from Dortmund, which is near Düsseldorf, near Essen, Köln, this area. I hitchhiked, and I found where the Dutch border was.
1 second. I want to before we get to that. Do you remember? So, did you speak with your parents about what was happening in Germany and about Hitler?
The children did not speak with the parents. Rather, they took in whatever they were like him sitting there and reading. It wasn't told to them, but they picked up enough surrounding. So
you were well aware.
I was well aware of it. I knew all the wars. I knew the wars in what was at this time. It was, I think, what Abyssinia War with Mussolini. It was the war in Spain. We knew everything what was going on because our life survived on daily existence. And I hitchhiked to the Dutch border, and I knew how to get to the Dutch border. And the next time I hitchhiked to Hamburg and to Bremen. to find out if, in case I wanted to escape, how do you jump on how do you go on a ship? How can you sneak on a ship to get out?
Where did you think you were going?
Anywhere. Anywhere except to be there. It didn't make any difference. You didn't have to go anywhere. You just had to escape. You see, people forget that it wasn't where you're going to go. It wasn't what you had to escape from. You know that it was a question of time. And then in the 1935, it started to get a little bit better in Germany. Not as bad as it was in 33 for the Jew. And because the Olympics were coming in 36. That's the reason they became very more careful. And it was very getting difficult because there was nothing for me to do. I couldn't learn a trade. We knew that you couldn't go to high school. It was difficult to get a job even as as an apprentice in any job, any form, because you work on Shabbos. And there was nothing to do. There was very little framework that the community did. It wasn't a well-organized community. And I thought there was one high school, vocational high school in Cologne, and one vocational high school in Frankfurt. At the age of 15, I took a little bit back. I told my parents goodbye. I took $5, and I hitchhiked from our city to Cologne. And I came to Cologne, and I said I would like to go to the school. They said, we got 500 students on a waiting list today. There's no place, absolutely no place. And I hung around there for a week, and I stayed in a home for the old people, you know, for the poor people there. I was sleeping on a board and eating soup, that's the whole food that they gave us. And I saw that there was no end. And I got up and I hitchhiked. I was never in my life in Frankfurt, and I hitchhiked from Cologne to Frankfurt. I found how to go here, and I found my way. And I wound up, it's interesting to know what was around. Then that in the middle of the way, I stopped the car, and by the time it stopped in front of me, there were 3 SS officers in an open Mercedes. I said, they would ask me, what do you want? I said, I'm going there and there. I said, you can come in. I sit in the car, they asked me, what are you, Hitler Youth? I said, no. Are you in the young folk, the younger group? I said, no. I said, what are you? I said, I'm Jewish. So they said, before we come into the town, you better jump off in the beginning. You jump out. And I arrived to Frankfurt, and I sent the car. I remember I came to I found the last one was an Englishman who came to visit for the Olympics already. And I couldn't speak to them. I couldn't speak English. They couldn't speak German. But we found I knew French because I learned in school, and they knew a little bit French, and we spoke a broken French, and they brought me to the railroad station in Frankfurt. They were going to go to Nuremberg, I think. And I sent the card home, and I went to the community, had the address written up there. Somebody found out where it was, and I sat there. And I said, there's no way to go. We don't have enough of our own. I said, I'm not going to come here. I'm not going to leave. I came here all the way from there. I'm not going to go back. It's your problem now. And they said, they want to go for lunch. I said, fine, lock the door. I stay here. They saw they got a problem on hand. And they told me to go to school and speak to the director. And if he accepts me, they'll register me for the school. And so it was. And I had a wonderful life. I was there for a little bit over a year. And I did very well. I did probably, my personal standing, I think, was the best. I was the best student, the best player, everything. I was the best. I was the Balkora. I was doing everything. I did very, very successful there. And then, when I came home, my parents told me they have a problem. That my older sister had gone in the meantime to Palestine already because she went on Achshara, and she went then. She was then I think 19 years. She'd gone to Israel already, to Palestine, not Israel. And she worked here, and she met some people, some relatives, and she worked on 3 jobs. She made some money, and she was able to get enough for a certificate, as my parents told me, for them and for my younger sister. But they couldn't get me on the certificate. So I told my parents not to worry about it, to go, because I am the top student there. Whenever place will open for emigration, whether to South Africa, you ask me where do you go? To South Africa, to Australia, to anywhere, I would get probably the first job. And they continued, and eventually they found out, my sister made arrangement to get a certificate for me too as a student, as a high school student. So I went there to Palestine, and we left in 1937, right after Pesach, to go to Palestine. We had to pass by we went by train to Trieste, and we had to pass by about 5 different border things until we got rid of the Nazis. And went by ship, and we came to Palestine. Came to Palestine, to Haifa on the afternoon or on the morning, and we looked. It looked something similar. What can I tell you? Oh, it looked like Jaffa looked about 20 years ago. See a lot of Arabs there, a couple of Jewish people there, all the harbor, like little town people running around. I looked at it, well, that's what I have, that's what I go. I remember we stayed the night in Haifa by some friends that we knew from Europe. And the next morning we took the train to go to Tel Aviv. In 1937, you could not go from Haifa to Tel Aviv by bus, because in the middle between Kalkilia and what's the other one, near Netanya, I forgot the name already. You could not go across there, they were shooting there. So you had to go by train from Tel Aviv to, it was called Ras El Ain, it's called Rosh Hashanah. And there you took a bus, Edet bus, not Edet, this was a Hamavia, Dan, whatever it was called then. And we went to Tel Aviv. I remember I arrived at night in Tel Aviv. I stayed the night by some relatives. It was very nice. And I saw on the table there grapefruits and oranges, the sense of abundance that you had when you came from there. And my sister had found us an apartment somewhere, an empty apartment in Tel Aviv, in Chov Brenner, right in the beginning, right in the heart of the center of Tel Aviv. And I slept the night. The next morning I came up, I got outside on the street, and I saw Allenby and Schenken, and I went down and I kneeled, and I said, Rabbanu Shalom, if there's something else I want out of life, I'm already in Eretz Israel. And I made an important decision. From that day on, I never spoke German again. And I went the next day, I went an hour later or so, I went on I walked and I asked people, Aryeh Pola Mizrahi. And they told me I bought in Chof Achad Ha'am, 110 or something.
Did you, in Germany, did you have connections with the people from Hapoel Mizrahi, Dr. Berg?
I was Blit Chalutz in that time.
Who was running that at the time? Were any of the people, was Dr. Berg still?
Berg, oh yeah, Berg used to come to visit then very often. It was part of what's the name? It was part of the Bnei Akiva.
Aryeh Handler?
Aryeh Handler, all these people. Aryeh Handler was in England. I don't think he ever came to Israel.
He did.
He did?
But at the time, I'm saying...
He lived in England most of the time.
No, but when you were...
But I knew about Aryeh Handler. I knew all those guys, and it was the Rotkes and what name. When I came to Israel, to Palestine, I started to look around. There was near Hadera, there was a Garin, which eventually, there are some friends from our town, eventually became the first kibbutz in Emek, in Galil. What's the name from Bnei Akiva? Teretzvi. That was the Garin of Teretzvi. And somehow I was ready to go. They were a little bit older than me, a couple of years older than me, but I would have managed. But I had parents, I had to provide parnasa. My parents, my father was 50 years old, and he was a merchant in Germany, and nothing he could do there. My mother worked as a dressmaker somewhere, and this was, and the rest was left on me to provide. I worked in the binyan, I worked in this, I worked in whatever, wherever you could go. I worked as a sabal in Amal. I was only 16, 17 years old. And as I went to the Mizrahi on Shabbat, I went to the Bnei Akiva. מי רוצה עולה חדש? Then what is interesting, who was then Bnei Akiva? The father was ציתונות במכולת, מכר עצים בשביל בניינים, דברים בשביל בניינים, כל אלה. זה שמו זהיר, מסחר זהיר. והם לא רוצו עולים חדשים, nicely dressed, talk to the girls. מה לי ולא עולים חדשים? מה יש לו לזה? זה יותר כאילו... like an entertainment program, like, for them, like a social club rather than anything else. And it was very, very difficult to find. There was no framework. What was the difficulty? You came there, and survival was under your hand. You had to find out where you can take a people. There was no organization. There was nobody, and there was nobody to go to. But you say Sochnut was not there. It was a frame maybe for political reasons, but it wasn't there for practical reasons. Whoever was able and had a trade and was able to work, was able to get himself into the Stadrut, then they try to take care of you, find you a job somewhere, this. If you're not, we're out. And I remember I went to the Mizrahi, and I already got a job, and I needed for them to get a permit that I go. The son of a bitch took my job to send somebody else and then took away my job. So yeah, I had bad experience with it. And in the end, there were local groups. For instance, there was Hitachdut Olei Germania or Hitachdut Olei Polania. All those difficult places had their own little organizations. And you had a frame, and I remember I got 1 or 2 jobs from the Hitachdut Olei Germania. This was what's the name? The guy who was there too. From the mayor of Yerushalayim, what's his name? Teddy Kollek was there. All this was the beginning of their political scenes where they acted. It was difficult socially. I had no friends. I didn't know people. I had no framework. And then somebody suggested to me I should go to the Horowitz. I said, "What? Me?" So I found out the Horowitz. I came to the Horowitz. I said, "אני רוצה להיות חבר Horowitz." It was in the month I was in Israel, in Palestine. He says, "תביא שילינג ושתי תמונות." אמרתי, אם אין לי שילינג, אז תביא שתי תמונות. And I was very much impressed. They sent me to the Balfour, the Beit HaBriyut. They sent me for Bdika Psychotechnik, what I'm suitable. I remember they gave me, what's the name, hangers with a spring inside, you know, for laundry hangers. And to take it apart and see if I can put it together. And I said, I'm suitable for mechanic. And they suggested to me the best way for my life for the future will be apprentice, even to they get less, but to be apprentice as a mechanic or in a factory where they steel workers, and I get to learn a trade and I have a little bit income. And how do you get a job? Everybody, כל אחד בא כל יום, נרשמת שהיה לך כמה ימי חסרי עבודה. יש אז עבודות, כן, יש שתי מקומות. מי בתור? מי שהיה לו ימי, אנחנו ניהלנו את זה לבד. מי שהיה לו ימי חסרי עבודה, קיבל את זה. I got a job, and I was starting to get very, very happy because I had it wasn't so much that I was successful to get the job, but I had a framework where I belonged to. It wasn't all depending on me totally. And they asked me, do you want to go to קבוצה חינוכית? I said, מה זה, איך אוכלים את זה? מה זה? And I went Shabbat afternoon, and I was in a very, very nice group. And the madrich, the first time there was a discussion about Manifesto Communisti. And you can imagine it's difficult in English or in German how difficult it was for me to sit there and listen to it in Hebrew. And well, what was nice, the next Shabbat we learned Bialik, Aryeh. In the third Shabbat we learned Yeshayahu. And I became part of this group of a very, very nice group, nice people. And let's say on Shabbat afternoon we had this discussion in the sniff, in the kfutza, and then everybody came together, let's say 4 o'clock, we had in a big hall, and this father there, we sat and told us from the Hasidim and from the Olim, for the first, from a side, much more, the guy, the Shomer, the father from the Shomrim, Yitzchak Said, and I think.
Sadeh.
Huh?
Sadeh?
Yitzchak, now Said.
Zaid.
Alexander Zaid. Alexander Zaid, with the historia של השומרים. And there was music very famous. He lives here in a house not far from there. A guy who used to write songs. They came to us, and then we started to learn things which I had never learned before in my life. Adam, Dmut Adam, Kavod al Adam, all the arachim, the humanity, what you call Western style of life, let's say the age of reason, all these things, what you could learn later on, this we start to get in orbit. And I became desperate to draw this culture because this was for me, I didn't have any culture from before. So suddenly I came to this, the important thing was for me, what was amazing and what I was grateful, I came here, somebody who was nothing, it was not here, not there, now I have an entity. They gave me a reason. I went to Avodah, what was Avodah? Todah, what was it? Avodah, Limdut, והתגשמות. זאת אומרת, the normal person from the normal, it was expected for him, if he wanted to fulfill himself as a normal, to learn Avodah והגשמה, ללכת לקיבוץ. Why? We learned, which was I think very important later on for when I went in Haganah and all the other things, it's not that we were heroes or something else. ההיסטוריה הטילה עלינו. We were tools of Jewish history. So once if you feel this, you may be afraid, but you feel a little bit different. And I want to go further to things that by accident, I don't know, because I didn't know, there was a young lady there in a Horowitz, and I became friendly with her, but she was not from our kfutza. And one day on a Wednesday night, I think, I came out from a room. I went downstairs and somebody started to punch me and knocked me down and I fell on my back. It hit me very hard. I fell with my head on my back and fainted. And I knew who hit me. I could see him who hit me. And I knew where he was going. And I woke up and I ran after them from Chof HaYarkon 100 until Mugrabi. And I called him Mugrabi and I beat him up. And they found out the guy who hit me was one of the champions of the Maccabiyah in 1936. And I beat him up. So somehow, everybody in Norway started to talk, oh, this guy. So I don't know. No, I didn't tell nobody, but somehow they must have heard it. And they called me in Albi was the newspaper, Davar, where all the underground offices were. They called me there that I became one of the group to beat up the English police officers. We started to make trouble as individuals, not as the police. And then one day they called me, I should come there, but I want to go into this course of ship because they knew I only could swim very well. And they asked me if I want to go. And I said, yeah, I was the kind of person I go anywhere.
What was this course?
It was called the course, it was to learn Yamaut. And the aim of the course was to learn a Yamaut and to try to bring ships from Europe to Cyprus, and from Cyprus to try to sneak them in. This was like the end of before the war, this was like end of 38. We knew the war was going to come, the leftover, there was a lot of Noah left over in Europe who had finished Achshara, and after they came out with the Sefer Lavan, and they couldn't go. We tried to bring them in. I was the only Tel Avivian. All the rest were kibbutznikim, who were dayagim, who were mipras from Ein Gef, there was Dot Yam, but they were in Haifa. They were working in Amal. They were not in Caesarea yet. I forgot already the names, but they all kibbutznikim. I was the only Chatuli here, and it was very, very difficult. It was very competitive. We had to work. We started working 5 o'clock in the morning to swim. And what was more interesting is, I think it's interesting for Israeli history. I was brought up very religious. I was religious in heart. How much I kept, can't even remember. However, when I went there, I took my tefillin with me. And this was like we slept 30 of us slept in the big hall. And I didn't want to put on film there in the room where you sleep. So I asked him if he had like a room and he had an office, if I can leave my tefillin in his office. And if I could daven there, he said, no problem. So they used to wake me up 4:30 in the morning. We had Shmirah every night there. At 4:30 used to wake me up, I used to put on film. And I don't think anybody ever mentioned anything about that's my business. There was no, that's your private business. It's not something, what do you call it? And it was very, very difficult. Physically, it was difficult from 5 o'clock. We went swimming, then we did this. Then in the morning we went out with the boats. For instance, we were like 10 people in a boat. 5 were undershirts, 5 not. We went out, maybe 10, 15 miles in rowing, and then took the boat, turned it over, and the other 5 who could swim, the other 5 were said who couldn't swim. You had to take care of them, You had to try to get the boat around, turn it around, try to save the boat. We learned this. In the afternoon, then we had lunch. In the afternoon, we learned sailing. Used to go.
Who was teaching this? This was under the...
See, this later on, there were one of them was the people who worked in Namal, or some of them worked before. They were from what do you call it? Hapoel. There was like a group of rowing sailing from Hapoel, from sport, and the Vulon there were like a sailing group of the Vulon also, and one of them is later on became, I think in 58, he became the commander of Israeli Navy, Shmuel Tankus. I mean, they were, you sit there, big people from there. It was that important to them. This was before Palmach. You see, Palyam was the first group. There was Plugot Yam. Then became Plugot Palmach and Plugot Machatz. They came afterwards. Every day the people from Dagana, Ben Gurion came in Galilee, and they wanted to see the first radio. We had to wear white shirts and everything. And we learned how to go, how to boat. This was, let's say, until about 7 o'clock, we ate. At night we learned navigation and metrology, because everything has to be part. For instance, the aim was that every one of us should be Katzin Miftaim on a ship, that we would be Achai, we would not be the sailors of the ship, but we would be able to give the orders to manage whatever had to be to bring the ship well to Cyprus. And we had to learn all these things we had to know. It was very engaging and difficult. When you look at the picture there, you'll see that we sit all in the room. In front of us is the lecturer who taught us. Everybody is sitting and writing, and I sit there like the constant. I didn't know how to write Hebrew. I could barely speak Hebrew. I was in there when I was in. Can you imagine? And I was in this. This was what considered the top course that ever was in Israel. And you were there, and I was maybe 4 months in Israel, in Palestine. This is what was the important thing. They took people. It didn't matter who you knew, where you know, whatever they thought they would be capable. They were not that much concerned for my benefit. They thought whether I can contribute to this was the issue, to succeed on the issue, rather than, it wasn't worried about my well-being. And during this time, there were 2 ships arrived in Horowitz, and once I was in this type of group, I didn't wear underpants, I only wore a small slip, so I can go and jump in the water right away. And I remember the first night in Horowitz in 1938, came a ship is called Tigerhill. This was one of the ships who tried to come here, and it ran away, and it almost rammed the British, saving the British. It shot on them, and I think they killed 2 or 3 people on deck. And then they ran away somewhere here to Gan Yavne, and at night they couldn't get air anymore, and it was too much. They came here, they ran on the, what do you call it? And I remember the whole night we removed half of the people here in Tel Aviv, on Sheraton, Hotel Sheraton there. We removed half of the people before the police came. And then later on, I kept on going in. I spoke English. That's my wife. I took him in. And then I ran again. I kept him out from the cycle. But we took out. And then what's interesting, 2 months later, came another ship. It's called Parita. This was from the Betar. They did not want to get off the ship. אנחנו מחכים למשטרה, תחי מדינת ישראל. Why? Because if they take them, you take off the certificates from the Mapai, and they have less Mapai, because this עד כדי כך, that what you have today going on in politics, it was no different in 1938, 37, 38. And things were getting difficult again. Here then in 1939 the war broke out. Jobs, economic was very, very difficult. My parents, I had to provide for my parents all the time. And even then it was not, try to understand the difficulty. You lived in a house and you had to prepare for Pesach. You had one ptilia and one primus. And you had to prepare for Pesach for a whole family on there. It was simple, difficult. I just can't tell you how the standards of expectations were, let's say, you spoke to young people. Especially, we don't give enough credit, the people who lived in the kibbutz. You know what their desire, what their standard was? לקום בבוקר, לשתות משהו, כוס קפה או לחמניה, ולעבוד כל היום, ולא הביתה, ויש לי מקום וזמן לקרוא עיתון. This was the דרישות. And I remember as a youngster, when I came there, you came there stoned and hot and burning, and you're going into living, and you don't, at night you can't cool off even, you can't cool off, and the next morning you have to go through this again, and through this again, and through this again. It is, just, I was amazed of the ability of the people to do, what really, what understanding that the lives of all these people who were belonged to any organization, and it's not, you can say what you want, it was these people who were from the kibbutzim, that they were even more than they had historia etila aleinu. They did twice, in my view, they did twice as much as historia aleinu. And I tell you, it could very well be that I remember when my older sister is 7 years older than me, but somehow I learned to read before I went to school. So when I was 7 years, I read already books. And I remember my sister came home. It was just a few years after, what do you call it? Up in Galil, was after Tel Chai. And there came out a book, Megillat Adamim. This is the whole story about Tel Chai. And I read this, and I kept reading and reading. I must have read it 15 times. And then this made me become a real Zionist stuff. And from there, I made the connection of what I learned about Jewish history in the Middle Ages. And they gave up their life for Judaism, and if I don't continue or do something else, I betray all they were idiots what they did all their life if they tried to survive for survival. And this somehow gave me the backup of it. And the war broke out. Oh yeah, it is indescribable what the Norah of it gave to me. It was far more important than my home.
Did you stay involved in Norah?
I stayed all the way to the end. So that's to old man, I'm 88 years old. I have two friends here in Tel Aviv. I have a woman, she's 85, who was me in the Kvutza in Horowitz then. Her husband died. And a young man, an old man, who was with me in Horowitz. He was with me in Royal Air Force in World War II. And later on we were partners in the factory where I was a member of a cooperative. And he still comes, and he also feels the same way about the Horowitz, that this was our, there was nothing. And it doesn't matter that because it was Horowitz. It was, let's say, all the תנועות של ארץ ישראל העובדת. השומע צעיר, מחנה עולים, גורדניה, אפילו צופים היו אותו דבר, everything was the same thing as the one who treated you away from the economy. Then even it was very common, it was almost acceptable, just like in Israel, in America, the good boy who goes to, or boy and girl who go to yeshiva for 8 years, Then they go the 9th year, they go to Israel and learn or where or what. Then they go to work in the kibbutz in the Chaklaut in the 9th year.
Were you a madrich in Norway?
I was a short time a madrich of, what's the name, of Hagana, of what do you call it, of marching, of shooting, of kebab, of judo, and this like this. Tagilei Seder, this was called Plugot HaNorobet. I was in there, what's the name, I was a madrich of Shimon Peres.
Really?
Shimon Peres was 3 years younger than me. He was a יחידה בינונית ואני was already מבוגר, שכבה מבוגרת. The war broke out and economics were getting worse in Palestine. And I felt that sooner or later I'm not going to sit home and fighting the Germans, I would have to go. And then one day when I walked, I saw a sign that the Royal Air Force was looking for people. Because this was then when the Germans used, as the war broke out, they used the submarines from here, and they couldn't get support, and there was a war in the Western Desert, the 8th Army. And they needed people, so they asked for volunteers. And I saw it, and I saw something else. This was a little bit we knew then, that the Royal Air Force was the lead of the armies of any service. And we registered, and we went there, and I went to the Royal Air Force. I was, just like the Israeli what I was before, I immediately volunteered for air service if I could, and I was able to squeeze myself into becoming a gunner, air gunner on a plane. And I was in it a year, and then I left out because I used to call it 5 minutes death. Because in the air battle, the first thing they shoot is the gunner, because afterwards he's a dead duck. So, and I was not so much concerned over my life as I concerned that I'm the only son, and my parents, what will my parents do without me? And I was there for 7 years. I was all over the Middle East. I was in Khartoum, I was in Sudan, I was in Egypt, I was in Greece, I was in, what do you call it? We were in Turkey once to protect the Syrian border. We were all over the Middle East. I was in Italy.
You were a gunner the whole time?
What?
You stayed a gunner or no?
No, I was a mechanic, engineering, and all the various different other things I did. Also, that as a professional, you made much more money. For instance, as a sergeant in engineering, I made more money than the captain as a pilot. I came out, I finished in 1945.
So you enlisted in 1939, 38?
Then?
When did you enlist? In
1939. I have still the military book here. And it was difficult. It was very, very difficult. There was a lot of loneliness. Because you were in a group. Sometimes there were times where you were in a Yechidah, there were maybe 5,000 people, and you were the only Jew or an Israeli, a Palestinian. There was nobody, and it was difficult to accommodate. If you're in the city, it's all bearable, but sitting out there in the Western Desert there somewhere, 500 miles from any place, you...
Did friends of yours join the Haganah or the...
When I went, there were very few people. Some people from there, there's a certain type of people who will volunteer for something new what nobody else went to. There was just dwarfs in those years. Maybe today is different. And it's interesting that my son made Aliyah in 1979, 1980. He was here, and he went here maybe a year in the army there. But even today, he's still a Lei Chadash. But he has 3 sons. and a daughter. The oldest son is 31 years old. The first one was in Sayeret Metkal, the second one was in Sayeret Tanchanim, and the third one was in Shaldak. And their attitude there is the same way, the same thing. The values that I taught my children, my grandchildren, were the same values that I grew up with. And I remember I told them but something was very, very important, that in Israel there are two type of people, two מדינot יש בישראל. מדינה אחת של חיילים אלמונים, את דגלנו נרים, את דגל החופש והדרור, בימים אפורים של דמעות ודמים, this is ביתר. The other one is עד מתי ספנים, עוד נסחוף ארגזים ונדען בטני אונייה. And what was their חלום? אונייה אדומה ואדום גם דגלה. Even today we have the same thing. It's not the same, the interest, what we say, top Israel, it's not the same common interest. And when what is very often fooling, because each one has their own interest. The same thing, the people in Tel Aviv don't have the same thing as the people in the Negev. As I came back from the army,
Can you tell me, are there any...
Oh yeah, during the war, it is indescribable, but nobody ever described it from where I read or anything. The type of standard of war living here during World War II. It was so bad, I remember there were at times that 2 days before Pesach, there were no matzahs yet, but they didn't get any flowers. And you were waiting, and we stood in line. And you stood, and you had to stand out of 400 people waiting until they give you 1 or 2 packages of matzahs. There was no white flour. Then later on, somewhere in 1942, 43, they were running short of industrial equipment or something. They started bringing a lot of work to Palestine, and this was the beginning of the first industrial revolution in Palestine.
Were there interesting operations or that you were involved in when you were in the Royal Air Force?
Oh, I conquered, what do you call it? I conquered Greece.
You conquered Greece?
From Germany in 1944. We came in, what's the name, in, what do you call it, the planes without engine.
Glider?
Gliders. We came in gliders into one of the border airport, on a big airport. We came in, conquered the, what do you call it? Conquered the airport. And then the planes came in there, and then from there we went into to Piraeus. From there, Piraeus went to Athens. And then in Athens, a week later or something, maybe 200,000 people came and demonstrated, welcome our liberators. And then a month later, they started to shoot at us because the civil war broke out.
How did you feel having been from Germany?
Oh, I tell you something, what is important? In 1942, which was the turning point in the World War II, it was the breakthrough in Al Alamein. When Rommel broke through in Al Alamein. This were the pictures from 1942. Once he broke through, the headquarters in Cairo already started to burn papers. They burned everything, definitely in Alexandria, and they were expected Rommel to go all the way to Palestine. And we had a question, do you stay here or you go back to defend your family? Or you do? And then it becomes difficult. I was one in the whole Yechidah, who was a Jew and who was a Palestinian. It was difficult when I didn't know where I stand. And then we started to hear what's going on in Europe, the Holocaust. In 42 already, we started that. And yet I wasn't observant, but yet I went into to the chaplain and I asked him if he had what's the name, if he had the Tanakh in Hebrew, and he found me one. And I sat down and I said, Megillat Echo. And my tears were running down, and I identified myself. This was happened and this was happened. And hour came, and then we got over it. But it was a very, very difficult. It was a lonely fight for each one of us. But what it done, it gave us something that you could see. Let's say in 1946 or 7, you could see who Chayal Meshuchar or Lo Chayal Meshuchar. You could right away see who he was and what he was. And I went to work right away. About a week later, I went to work. Various different things. And I didn't get involved with the political area. I had with myself to do, of economic survival. Because I was 25 years old. I had to start making a living. I had to have a future. And it was difficult when you came from European middle class. You had different. I had a girlfriend that had this young lady who I know she's here. She was my friend. But I wouldn't marry her because you're German. You don't marry until you have a profession. You have a business you can provide for her. To marry, just to be together and then go away for 2 years or 3 years or 1 year. It was not there. And by the time we came home, I was already a grown man. There were almost no girls around. There was leftover, you know. Oh, leftover, this one was like this and this one was like this. So that is the reason you can see. Eventually, I married my wife 9 years younger than me because I didn't want leftovers. And I went to work. It was difficult. And Melchemet HaShichrur, I participated in the Shayarot because I was a mechanic in Shayarot Yerushalayim. And because I was a mechanic, especially I was the mechanic of the whole Shayara.
Wait, so you were working, did you enlist in the... I
didn't have to enlist, there was a lot of it was, there were times you could do both. I was not even let go to work. When I enlisted, I went back, they took me out from the army, and they brought me back because I was making the bombs to make from Tzinorot, from steel tubes. We used to make the heads on it and weld them on and make the tails. And we had the trucks outside, what's the name, from Tel Aviv, waiting outside. And from there they went to Herzliya to fill up with powder. And then later on, I did not participate that much in Melchemet HaShichrur. And then later on, they took me in for 18 months in the army at the age of 30, because they said September 30th is the cutting point, and I was October 5th for the 5 days. I had to serve other 18 months in the what do you call it, in the army. And I told them, look, I was a Samal Rishon in the Aryeh. You give me my rank, fine, I'll continue to. If not, I'm not going to start off all over again. So at the end, they made me, they made me Katzin Tarbut without the rank. And I ate in Chad Shel Ktinim, and what do you call it, and as a Chayal Pashut, I was Katzin Mate in Miluim. It was very difficult. And Melchemet HaShichrur is, oh yeah, that's what I must tell you what's interesting was maybe, that when I worked in the factory, I did very well. This was all some of the things I learned in 2-3 years what takes 20-25 years to be, master in it. And in 1948, about a week before the British were supposed to leave, you had already about 15-20 ships in Tel Aviv waiting to bring in weapons. But they stood outside to the territorial waters. And a Polish ship came in, and it alal Shirton, and it broke in the middle. Now the problem that if they will pull the ship, it'll break apart and block the entrance to the Namal. And no choice, they brought in a Danish salvage ship, and they didn't know anything, and then they said you have to make steel connections between the two halves and then drag it out.
Just time out. Please.
One of the things, when I came back after the war, I started during the time when I was working, suddenly there was no work, and I was laid off. Like half the people in the factory were laid off, and I was very depressed. I was 26 years old. I was already 6-7 years in the army, even here. I have nothing. What's the sense for me looking? What was the difficulty? No education, no money, no trade, no nothing, no hope for the future. There was no hope it's ever going to get better. There was no basis to hope. And I remember I walked by myself here. I walked to the Tzadayam at night. Before I sat with the Chevra, we had like a group of people who were together, who knew each other. Were like every night we used to sit in the same Beit Cafe. And then before I went home, I walked to Sfatayam because I didn't know what to do the next morning. And I was halfway committing suicide. So that is the reason when later on, when I had the opportunity and the capability to buy this apartment, I can see what it is, I can look over there. I say, well, I overcome it. And what do you call it, after the war, it is, for instance, I remember, with the ship, I was telling you about the ship, and there came to the conclusion that they have to put on those steel beams to pull the ship out. And you can't weld it, you have to connect it with rivets. And you have to make rivets, I would say, somewhere about 2-inch rivets, this size rivets. In all Israel, only 2 people who could rivet this thing. One person and me, one person from Haifa and me. And for this, you needed like a whole group of people that climbed on top of the ship and heating up the rivets, then through pipes throwing down, and they inside held contra, and we have to go with the power hammer like this. And I worked 54 hours straight through. This was like a day before, before the Declaration of Independence. This was on Friday afternoon I finished. That's like they had already declared. Next morning I come here in Sfatayam. I went early, about 8 o'clock, and I met my friend. And the Egyptians started to bomb Tel Aviv. I remember they bombed here in Tel Aviv, and I was over there in Machne Yona, which is where the airport is in Tel Aviv. Not in Lut. Here the airport, there's a small airport here too. It was called Machne Yona then. And we kept on asking questions. There were no questions. There were doubts whether they were able to succeed, what will be. It was until almost until the second ceasefire. After the second ceasefire, there was no question about it. And then what happened?
As somebody who had fought with the British
Yeah.
during World War II. And now it was the period after the war, and the British were still here, and there were all kinds of movements to get the British to go, and the Etzel and Lechi and the Haganah. And what were your thoughts? What were your? Did you have any feelings about that? As
Both of them are victims of history. I mean, put it this way, just as a positive influence, there's a Norwegian on me, just as much as the British Army, to be a gentleman, to when you see an old lady carrying a bag of vegetables from the woodland, you know, this is what the English could do. See a woman going there, they take her bag and walk her home. There was a lot to be learned from, for instance, we had people in the airport, young people who didn't shave yet. And we went at night to the bar, you know, and then they used to go out 2 o'clock in the morning. Very often they used to go out on orders at night, 2 o'clock in the morning. While they were sitting in the bar, take out their money, put it on the table, and if I don't come back, have a drink on me. There were 17, 18-year-old boys. So when the army Israeli learned here, they was from somebody that they learned it from.
do you remember the period leading up to around the UN vote?
No, I will tell you something more interesting. While I was in Greece, this was already the beginning of the civil war here in Israel, in Palestine. And I remember in Athens, there was an army newspaper, Jews killed 2 British policemen. I wrote a letter to the editor. I said that every day, more than 2 British policemen are killed anywhere in the world. And you give it a small, you don't even mention it. And what you write now is not just to the 60 or 80,000 Jews who fight in the Allied armies. And before you send it out to the newspaper, you have to send it out to the commanding officer for censoring. And he called me in, and he helped me to improve the letter. And then he said, you know what, I would like you to, on Friday, to give a lecture to the people about what the Palestinian, what the problem is, what the discussion, so the people would not be in the dark end. So this is what I can tell you, and similar what you would like to hear. This was the environment. It was unfortunate that they were our combatants. It would be better if somebody else would have been there, because they were very, I could only think that they were extremely fair. Now, you wouldn't say this if you were in Lehi. So it's different. But I think they contributed a lot. For instance, almost 50% of the people who were in the British Army, whether they were in the Brigade or in the Air Force, they were in all the military forces. They killed the base. Half of the Alufim in the army were in the British Army. And then later on, as the Medina came, what happened here? The British were extremely good in building up the civil service. Look, we had post office and railroads and what's name. Other countries would have started from nothing. We had it all. And there's nothing better than a British civil servant. He is not an independent person. He becomes a servant to the job. And we had to, when after the Medina, you had to, who could you take? There were maybe 10% who worked for the British, who stayed with it. The other people, who can you rely on? Kibbutznikim. They became the basis, kibbutznikim or ex-kibbutznikim, of the basis of the bureaucracy. Now there's one problem. The kibbutznik of the bureaucracy, he thinks he's in Siddur Avodah. He can tell everybody where he should go to work. He thinks he can dominate the society. And he forgets that he's a servant of society. This created in the beginning a very, very difficult. This created probably the whole problem, what you even have today in civil service. Then you started with Nukudot. There was nothing to eat. There was Tzena. Joseph, one of the ministers was Joseph on what do you call it? If you want to buy underpants, one day they chilku underpants. You had to take a day off and go and stand in line to buy underpants. The other day you had to stand in line to buy gufiot. Yeah, I saw something also interesting. You couldn't get material to make a suit. See, I have a picture there where I got married. See there? You know what kind of suit I have there? I wore a suit by Alte Sachen and went to the tailor. And I turned around the outside to the inside and we fixed the holes there. And I wore this. How you do? And I came to the conclusion that the Ofek, the horizon, is comparatively very narrow. After I've been all over the world, it was very limited. And I decided I want to try to go to America. What did I want to go to America? Again, simple. I think I go and work there very hard. And I haven't saved enough money to buy 2 buggers, dachporim. One I rent out, one I repair or work myself. That's a very, very nice income. Or buy 2 big trailers. And rent one out and one this is to provide some sort of economic basis for myself. And what I want to do in America, it was right after World War II yet. There were no parts. I would buy up old cars, how you call it, break them up and put on all the parts, the used parts, and sell used parts, not to come out and take it out and have them all laying down. You want to buy, you take a chance. And no commitment. And somehow it didn't work out myself. And I was very lucky. I went to work. I arrived in America on a Tuesday. On Wednesday I went on Center Street, you know where it is? Center Street, you know, right in the middle downtown, near Canal Street there. And I saw a factory there. I said, you need somebody? We started talking, and I started to work on Thursday. I worked there about a couple of months, and then I worked in the shipyard. Then left it all. In the shipyard, I made something in the vicinity of $200 a week, which was a very, very good income already. And I left it, and I went to work for $35 a week to learn how to sell surplus metals. So I got into the business and so forth. And what I succeeded was what some of the most dominant things in my life. At the age of 1968, I was 58 years old. At the age of 58, I went to university without having ever gone to high school. And I went 8 years at night to Queen's College. And I graduated magna cum laude in political science and history. And this helped me later on to be a grandfather to my children, a guide to their education and so forth, and a whole these are the things. But I wanted to understand why. I'm fortunate. I have 2 apartments. I have one apartment in Jerusalem, where my children live, and I have an apartment there, and I have an apartment here in Tel Aviv. Jerusalem is a very boring city. I leave there Motzei Shabbat and come back on Thursday morning. Because Shabbat in Tel Aviv is terrible. It's so depressing. It's just, it's an opposition to whatever you want, and somehow you can do it once or twice, but in the end it becomes very, very, very depressing for me. And I was fortunate. From this way, it could be the accumulation of my views as a child and of my education. I have 3 sons. All 3 sons went to yeshiva, and went one extra year after yeshiva to Israel. And one went to university, and two went to Cambridge. I have 4 grandchildren from my son here in Israel. All 3 were 5 years army. 3 years in the army, and 1 year before in yeshiva, 1 year after yeshiva. And my youngest granddaughter is now in the army, and even the one in Israel. One granddaughter was a year here in yeshiva in 1 year, and my other grandson from my son in Israel is also here in yeshiva now 1 year. So therefore, somehow the cultural things that I picked up during my life, and there's no question about it. It is no accident because Grandpa said it's a good idea. 50% is the influence. And it's interesting also that more than 70% of my grandchildren all study, what's the name? Plato, Aristotle, and Machiavelli. This is Grandpa's. So what is the story probably interesting is that if you have a framework and you're able to pick up some of the cultural influences, these are the ones who I think dominate a person's life. I don't think it's accident or parent or home or so forth. And I thank God that every day I say, Atov u'metiv. I make a bracha al Atov u'metiv. Must be.
Thank you very much. What we're going to do now
is
we're going to take a few of the pictures.
Oh, yeah, it's opposite. I have a granddaughter. My granddaughter, she is Israeli. She's 19 years old. She's now in the army. My son, my oldest son, the one with the professor, who got divorced after 35 years. The other 3 grandsons who got married during a year and a half. All 3 were married in 1 year, about within a year or 2 after the divorce. The granddaughter, I think she was very much hurt and influenced by the period because you don't get divorced. There must be a cumulative period of 10 to 15 years, and she was right in the middle of it. The problem in school, I think what she had, attention, what do you call this? Where they give Ritalin. I don't believe in it. And in the end, I start taking over, and I sat with her and I start explaining to her that I think it's a question of ego, of understanding, of self-confidence. And I said, look, if you got 60 in math, it don't mean nothing. You know why? Because you got just as well if you want to get 95. Don't know whether you can get 100, but you can get 95. Because you don't want to. And you can say to yourself, well, if I wanted, I could get 95, but I'm not interested in it. But if you want, you can do anything. And somehow, over a period of 2-3 years, I built up a concept with her of you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. And then, as the period went on, I remember she got a test in biology or something. She came home with 105. I said, how do you do it? He said, I remember Grandpa standing behind me. He says to me, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. So it is very important that what the person grew up in his life, that he passed and that he learned, unless he is not able to transfer it over to the next generation, it's totally valueless. There's nothing. There's no interest. But the same thing is true in Judaism, in religious Judaism. If the Judaism that you practice is not transferable to the next generation, then it's a special thing, some uniqueness, and fine, but it doesn't have to happen anymore. And the essence of it is, see, it's what I'm proud of. And I tell my grandchildren now, you learn on the Chut HaMshulash. My grandfather, my father, and me is one Chut. Myself, my son, and my grandchildren is the second Chut. I ask him now, when they're bar mitzvah or something, that you are החלק האחרון של החוט המשולש, או החלק הראשון של החותם של השבת. אתם צריכים להחליט מה אתם תהיו. I think this is the essence of the ability of your life, of the model of your... How does it play into the next generation?
Very good. Thank you very much.
Please.
This is in 1950. When I was in Tzal, I was a Katzin Tarbut without a rank. And as a private soldier, I sat in a Mate Chativati. There's a picture of the first course of the Palyam. I was sitting in the first row. This was at night when we learned navigation and meteorology. And it's to be noticed that everybody was writing, and I only tried to concentrate myself with my eyes because I couldn't write Hebrew. I barely could speak it. I think I explained to you already this.
Just say something.
What can I say? This is, my son found it somewhere and he was able to get it. And this is science. You cannot see this is the date.
No, don't take it.
This is the date of the 19th of May, 1941.
Okay.
I cannot see the only two people. They were in World War II. They were like special commandos who fought in Greece with a private boat. They were like guerrillas. Like the same thing but Hamas does, or the other one. They did it to the Germans.
Were they Asira?
And?
There were people from the course with you that were part of your day?
No, they weren't. No. Later on, after the course, we almost had no connection because very often when we went as individuals. We didn't know we very rarely went as a group of anything. So therefore, the less you know of the other person, the less if you have to talk to you.
Was anybody from your course part of the Yordei Asira?
Yeah, more than half. למעלה 4 אנשים האלה שהיו מדריכים, אז שכחתי את השם של זה, אתם צריכים להוסיף, מי שזה לא היה מפקד על האסירה ביורדי אסירה, שכחתי שמו, השני היה אהרונצ'יק, והשלישי זה שכחתי השלישי הוא היה אחר כך מפקד חיל הים הישראלי, והשני זה יעקב אוגרף.
מה אנחנו רואים כאן?
זה תמונה של היום העצמאות הראשון, 1949. זה היה מפקד קצין תרבות הראשי של צה"ל, ואני הייתי קצין תרבות חטיבתי, שהייתי חייל פשוט. וזה, כל נוסעים העירה לתל אביב, זה היה על יד סרפנט, שנסענו לשם העירה בשביל המצעד. This picture is my wife when she came back from בית ספר לחקלאות, and this is me just before I went to America. We were already married then. When I went, I started to go out with my wife in 1949. Yeah, for 1949. She was 19 years old. She had come out of the concentration camp when she was 15. We come from the same city. I think I was 9 years old when she was born, and the father gave when they gave a kiddush in the house. And part of my life, my aim was, she had no time to education. I don't think she learned more than 2 years in any school. And I made it my effort in my life that today, my wife reads 3 newspapers a day. And to give this, all what she did not have, what she didn't have in childhood, I try to give her. That is the reason I fulfilled my elderness. So at the same time, while I was a husband, I was a teacher. And it's very, very beneficiary because today I have a partner. It took 80 years or 57 years we are married, but it worked out very, very well. I would say that whatever I did or whatever I succeeded was totally without her help. I don't know whether it was her help, but it wasn't. She was a great part of it.